Emilio Valerio was driving through the rain when he saw her standing at the gate of his own estate, a woman in a thin jacket, hunched over 3 small children in the cold. He almost didn't stop. He almost kept driving, the way he'd kept driving past everything that wasn't business for the last 3.5 years. But then his headlights caught the face of the boy in her arms, and his foot slammed the brake so hard the tires screamed against the wet asphalt. Those storm-gray eyes, that sharp jaw, that tiny crescent-shaped birthmark just below the left ear. Emilio Valerio had seen that face every single morning for 37 years, in his own mirror. There were 3 of them, triplets, 2 girls and a boy, no older than 2, maybe 3, and they all wore pieces of him like a confession no one had made. The woman looked up, and he knew her. He knew her the way a man knows the one thing he'd tried and failed to forget. She didn't recognize him, not yet, not in the dark, not after everything. She just saw a man standing in the rain who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. "You okay, mister?" she said. "You don't look so good. Come inside. I'm cleaning the house tonight. It's warm in there." She was inviting him into the very mansion she had spent months cleaning in secret, but in the blinding rain and the weight of her own exhaustion, she hadn't yet realized that the broken man before her was the one man she had never truly stopped loving. But what Emilio didn't know, what he couldn't have known standing there in the rain staring at children who carried his bloodline, was that everything that had led to this moment, every lie, every betrayal, every silent year, had been engineered by the people he'd trusted most. If this story grips you, hit like and share it with someone who needs it today. And subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter of what's coming. Now let's go back to where it all started. Back to when Emilio Valerio was still untouchable, before the one lie that brought a king to his knees. 8 years ago, when Emilio Valerio was only 29, he stood in the dark oak paneled office on the top floor of Valerio Tower in downtown Chicago and received from his father the key to every key. Conrad Valerio, 62 years old, his back still straight as steel, his silver hair slicked back without a single strand out of place, rested his wrinkled hand on his son's shoulder and said only one sentence. "From now on, Chicago is yours." There was no ceremony. There was no speech. There were only 2 men in a room where the scent of Cuban cigars and leather had seeped into every grain of wood for 40 years. The empire Emilio inherited wasn't the kind of thing anyone could see on any tax return. On the surface, it was a chain of legal casinos stretching from Chicago to Detroit, shipping ports along Lake Michigan, and dozens of commercial towers and luxury apartment buildings scattered across the Midwest. Beneath that surface was the thing no one dared name out loud. The thing that made the police chief nod when he met Emilio on the street, made a federal judge take his call at midnight, and made every corner from the north side to the south side understand that the name Valerio wasn't something you spoke aloud, but something you lowered your voice for when it had to be mentioned. Conrad retired, but he never truly let go. He still sat in the Gold Coast mansion every Sunday morning, still received reports from men Emilio didn't even know were still reporting, still called his son every Friday night with the same question: "Is there anything I need to know?" And even though Emilio was already king, he still answered that call every week, because in this world, even a king had someone he had to bow his head to, and that man was his father. It was Conrad who arranged the marriage. Felicity Ashford, the only daughter of the Ashford family, a financial empire based on Wall Street, where money was washed cleaner than any machine Emilio had ever owned. Victoria Ashford, Felicity's mother, 62 years old, was the kind of woman even Conrad had to admit was formidable. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She only smiled, and everything she wanted happened. The wedding was held at the Drake Hotel with 600 guests, and every society paper called it the alliance of the decade. Emilio wore a black suit, Felicity wore a white gown, and they looked at each other exactly once during the entire ceremony, when the priest told them to kiss. It was the coldest kiss Emilio had ever tasted. 3 years passed, like water sliding across glass, leaving behind nothing but emptiness. Felicity lived in the Gold Coast penthouse, shopping, going to spas, attending charity events for photographs. Emilio lived in the Lake Forest mansion, working 16 hours a day, coming home at midnight to a house 400 square meters wide, without a single human sound inside it. They met at events, stood side by side, smiled for cameras, then got into 2 different cars and drove in 2 different directions. No one asked. No one needed to ask. By the 3rd year, the pressure began. Victoria Ashford called Felicity every week, and Felicity passed the message to Emilio in a flat voice, as if she were reading from a menu. "My mother wants to know when we're having a child." Conrad was more direct. During one Sunday dinner, he set down his wine glass and looked at his son. "A Valerio without an heir is a Valerio that's dying, Emilio. Don't make me say this a second time." Beside Emilio through all those years was Grant Kensington, 39 years old, half a head taller than Emilio, with an easy smile and a firm handshake. They had grown up together on the streets of the South Side when neither of them had anything but their fists and their loyalty. Grant was the only man Emilio trusted so completely that he never checked on him. He was his second in command. He was his brother. He was the man Emilio would later say was the greatest mistake of his life. But at that time, when both Victoria and Conrad were pressing down on him, it was Grant who clapped a hand on Emilio's shoulder and said, "Go get checked so they can stop worrying. You're strong as an ox. The results are just a formality." Emilio agreed. He was confident, worked out every day, ate with discipline, and his body was a machine maintained to perfection. The doctor's appointment was nothing more than a small square on that week's schedule. Nothing more. He was wrong, and the price of that mistake wasn't something that could ever be measured in money. Dr. Philip Hargrove's private clinic was on the 12th floor of Northwestern Memorial Hospital. The kind of place ordinary people didn't even know existed. The kind of place with walnut doors, Italian leather chairs, and fresh flowers replaced every morning. Hargrove was 63, with gold-rimmed glasses and silver hair brushed into perfect order, the personal physician of the Ashford family for 30 years, appointed by Victoria Ashford to serve as the shared doctor for both families immediately after the wedding. Emilio sat across from him that Wednesday afternoon, with the confidence of a man who had never received a bad result about anything in his life. Hargrove opened the file, adjusted his glasses, and said in a voice as steady as if he were reading a weather forecast, "Severe azoospermia. Complete infertility. No possibility of having biological children. We've run the test 3 times. The results haven't changed." Emilio couldn't remember how long he remained in that room after those words. Maybe 5 minutes. Maybe half an hour. He remembered Hargrove continuing to speak about options, about artificial insemination with donor sperm, about adoption, but every word reached him like an echo underwater, distorted and meaningless. He stood, shook the doctor's hand because that was instinct, because Conrad had taught him from childhood that a Valerio never let anyone see him bleed, then walked out into the hallway, through the waiting room, down the elevator, across the hospital lobby with the steady stride of a man who was entirely normal. He held himself together until the car door closed. Inside the black Bentley parked on the 3rd level of the garage, Emilio Valerio placed both hands on the steering wheel and felt them shaking so badly that he couldn't turn the key. He sat there in the darkness of the hospital parking garage, with the smell of concrete and engine oil all around him, and for the first time in his life, understood what absolute helplessness felt like. He could buy this entire city. He could give orders over the living and the dead. But he couldn't command his own body to create the one thing that even the most ordinary laborer could produce after a single drunken night. Felicity knew the result before Emilio even made it home. He didn't ask who had told her, but he knew. Hargrove had called Victoria, Victoria had called Felicity, and that chain of links moved faster than any line of communication in his empire. That night, Felicity wasn't at the penthouse. She was sitting in the living room of the Lake Forest mansion, something that rarely happened, waiting for him. Not because she was worried, because she wanted to say it and be done with it. "I didn't sign up for this marriage to live with a man who can't give me the one thing that matters most," Felicity said, her voice as flat as the marble floor beneath her feet. "My lawyer will contact your lawyer on Monday." She stood, pulled the suitcase she had packed before he got home, and walked out the door without looking back. Emilio didn't stop her. Not because he didn't care, but because he knew she was right. This marriage was a contract, and he had just failed the one condition both sides actually cared about. The following week was the week Emilio learned that bad news never arrived alone. Victoria Ashford withdrew the entire financial alliance within 48 hours. $23 million of Ashford investment was pulled out of Valerio real estate projects. 2 money laundering arrangements through Ashford's investment bank were canceled without notice. Emilio had to cover the loss with reserve cash, and for the first time in the history of the empire, cash flow tightened enough that captains began to whisper. Conrad knew everything. Of course he knew, but he didn't call that Friday night. He didn't call the week after. He didn't call the week after that. 3 weeks of silence from the father whose calls Emilio had answered every single week for 15 years without missing one. That silence weighed more than any scolding ever could, because it said Conrad wasn't angry, he was disappointed. And in the Valerio family, disappointment was a sentence with no date of pardon. Emilio was still the boss. He still sat at the head of the table in every meeting. He still gave orders and everyone still obeyed. No one dared mention the divorce or the test results in front of him, because even if he was breaking inside, on the outside, Emilio Valerio was still the man the entire city knew better than to provoke. But every night, when the Lake Forest mansion sank into silence, and he stood alone in a bedroom larger than most apartments in Chicago, Emilio looked into the mirror and saw the thing no one else was allowed to see. The crack. Not in his face, in his eyes. The kind of crack only the person carrying it could recognize. The kind no money and no power could ever seal shut. He lost the wife he didn't love, but he also lost the thing he never knew he wanted, until he was told he'd never have it. In the months after Felicity left, Emilio Valerio turned the Lake Forest mansion into what it truly was, a fortress, with no one left to protect. He stopped holding meetings at home, stopped inviting anyone over for dinner, even stopped turning on the lights in rooms he never used. The 400-square-meter mansion shrank down to 3 spaces: the bedroom, the office, and the kitchen, where he sat alone drinking whiskey at 2 o'clock in the morning. He hired a cleaning company to come 3 times a week, but always arranged the schedule so he was never home when they arrived, because Emilio didn't want anyone to see the house in the state it was in, not dirty, but empty. The kind of empty that would make an outsider understand at once that the man living there had stopped thinking of it as home a long time ago. He still went to Valerio Tower every morning. He still led meetings. He still signed orders. But the observant ones noticed the change. He no longer stayed for drinks after meetings, no longer asked about his men's wives and children, no longer said anything beyond work. Emilio Valerio was still king, but he was the kind of king who sat alone on the throne in an empty room and didn't care who was counting footsteps in the hallway outside. Grant Kensington counted. Every single one. He began with small things, the kind so small no one noticed unless they were already looking. A dinner with the captain in charge of the port district that Grant never reported back to Emilio. A private call with the casino manager in Detroit, under the excuse of restructuring personnel for efficiency. A sentence dropped in the middle of a poker table with 3 senior captains. A boss without an heir. Who's the long-term plan for? We should be thinking about our own future. No one objected. No one reported it to Emilio. Because Grant wasn't wrong. In this world, an empire without a successor was an empire counting down, and everyone wanted to stand beside the man who would take power when the clock hit 0. Grant met Victoria Ashford twice during those 6 months, both times at an upscale Japanese restaurant in Naperville, far enough from Chicago that no one would recognize them, private enough that there would be no witnesses. What they discussed, no one knew, but Yelena Petrova knew they met. Yelena, 48 years old, housekeeper to the Valerio family for 20 years, the Russian woman Conrad had pulled off the streets when she was only 18, was the only person in this house who had made a habit of never speaking until she was asked. She didn't watch Grant because anyone had told her to. She watched him by instinct, because 30 years in this world had taught her that the person smiling the most in the room was usually the one best at hiding a knife. She recorded the dates, the times, the locations, tucked them into her memory the way a person loaded bullets into a magazine, and waited for the day she might need to fire. Meanwhile, Emilio knew nothing, not because he had lost the ability to read people, but because he had stopped caring enough to read them. The crack he saw in the mirror every night had spread wider now. No one could see it, but it was eating him away from the inside, turning the sharpest mafia boss in Chicago into a man who only wanted to be left alone. He came back to the mansion every evening, drove into the garage, walked through hallways the cleaning crew had polished to a shine, sat down in the kitchen, poured whiskey, and stared into the darkness beyond the windows until his eyes grew heavy enough for sleep. The house was so clean it felt soulless. Everything was in its place. Not a speck of dust, not a trace of life. Exactly the way Emilio wanted it, because if there was nothing here, then there was nothing left to lose. He didn't know that 3 times a week, while he was away, a 24-year-old girl from a small town in southern Illinois stepped through that door, wiped down every stare, and wondered who the owner of this sorrowful house was. He didn't know until a Thursday night in March, when he came home earlier than expected, stepped through the front door in the dark, and saw her standing in the middle of the staircase, gripping a broom handle like a weapon, eyes wide, her voice ringing through the foyer. "Who the hell are you?" Phoebe Langdon didn't understand fear the way most people did. She had lost her father at 6 in an accident at a quarry on the edge of Ridgeway, a town so small the post office and the church shared the same parking lot. Her mother worked at the canning factory 14 hours a day, steadily, for 16 years, until her lungs refused to keep going, and she died in a county hospital bed when Phoebe was 22. Phoebe stood in the hospital lobby, signing the death certificate with hands that still smelled of dish soap because she had just finished a dishwashing shift at a roadside diner, then wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, walked outside, looked up at the gray southern Illinois sky, and told herself she wasn't going to die there. 3 weeks later, Phoebe sold everything her mother had left behind, got barely enough to make $200, and bought a Greyhound bus ticket to Chicago. She arrived in the Windy City with one backpack, one pair of sneakers, and the kind of pride her mother had pressed into her along with the sentence she repeated every night before bed. "Never bow your head to anyone just because they've got more money than you, Phoebe. Money doesn't make a backbone." In Chicago, she did everything. Washed dishes on the night shift at a Greek restaurant on Halsted Street, stacked inventory at an Amazon warehouse in Joliet from 4 in the morning. And when a cleaning company hired her to clean luxury mansions, she saw it as a big step up because the pay was better and she didn't have to stand in a freezing warehouse for 10 hours straight. The company told her only one thing about the Lake Forest mansion: VIP client, don't ask names, don't take pictures, don't touch anything except what needs to be cleaned, finish the job and leave. She went there 3 times a week for 4 months without meeting a single person. The house looked like an abandoned museum, beautiful in a cold way, everything expensive, yet nothing carrying any trace of the person who lived there. No family photos on the shelves, no coffee cup forgotten on the table, not a single pair of shoes left crooked by the front door. Phoebe dusted paintings she guessed were worth an entire year of her rent, and sometimes wondered just how sad the owner of this house had to be to leave it like that. Then came that Thursday night in March. She was wiping down the staircase on the 2nd floor, one earbud in, country music playing softly, when the sound of the front door opening froze her in place. The company had said the owner was never home at this hour, but footsteps were coming up, heavy, even, and certain. Phoebe did what any girl raised in Ridgeway would have done. Now, standing on those same stairs, she gripped the broom handle tight, staring down at the man who had just entered her temporary sanctuary. Emilio Valerio stopped. His eyes took half a second to adjust in the dark and find her. Thin, hair tied high, white t-shirt marked with streaks of floor cleaner, one hand lifting a broom handle like a sword, eyes wide, but not from fear, from being ready to swing if she had to. No one had said the words, "Who the hell are you?" to Emilio Valerio in 15 years. Everyone knew who he was. Everyone lowered their head, or at least avoided looking straight into his eyes. But this girl didn't know. She only saw a strange man walking into the house she was responsible for, and she answered not with fear, but with a broom handle. Emilio almost laughed, but his face had forgotten how to do that. "I live here," he said. Phoebe lowered the broom handle a little, but not all the way. "The company said the owner's never home on this day. I came back early. Next time call first. You almost got a broom to the head." Then she turned back to wiping the stairs, as if threatening the man who controlled half of Chicago was the most ordinary thing in the world. Emilio stood there a few seconds longer, watching her, then walked into the kitchen. He didn't know why, but the following week he started changing his schedule so he'd get home on the days she worked. He didn't admit that to himself. He only said he needed to pick up papers, needed to check the house, needed this and that. But every time he came home, she was there. And every time, she spoke to him as if he were ordinary. No deference, no calculation, just a girl talking to a man who lived alone in a house far too big for one person. The 3rd time they met, she opened his refrigerator and stared at the empty space inside long enough to make Emilio feel embarrassed. "You live here, and your fridge is emptier than my rented room," she said. Then, without asking permission, she searched through the kitchen, found a single packet of instant noodles, shoved into the back of a cabinet, cooked it, added the egg she had brought in her lunchbox, and set the bowl in front of him. Emilio looked at the noodles with the egg, then looked at her. It was the first meal anyone had cooked for him in that house since the day Felicity walked out. He ate. She sat across from him, eating the cold rice she had brought from home, and the two of them ate in a silence that, strangely, wasn't uncomfortable at all. In the weeks that followed, Phoebe started asking him the kinds of questions she asked anyone, because she was the kind of person who asked out of care, not out of curiosity. One evening, while she was dusting the bookshelves in the living room, and Emilio was sitting on the sofa pretending to read a financial report, she stopped, looked around the huge, cold room, and asked, "Does the man who owns this house ever laugh?" She didn't know she was asking the owner himself. And for the first time in years, Emilio Valerio almost smiled. 5 months after that first bowl of instant noodles, the Lake Forest mansion no longer felt like a museum. Not because the furniture had changed, but because the air had. Phoebe began leaving behind small things she didn't think Emilio noticed, but he noticed every one of them. A chicken sandwich wrapped in wax paper left outside his office door on nights she knew he hadn't eaten. A little note taped to the refrigerator that said, "The fridge is still empty. You're a grown man, you know." A clean handkerchief folded neatly on the stair rail, exactly where he always placed his hand on the way up. Emilio answered in his own way, also through small things he never admitted to. When the kitchen faucet started leaking, he fixed it himself at midnight instead of calling a plumber, and when Phoebe asked who had repaired it, he said, maybe it fixed itself. When the hallway light on the second floor burned out, he replaced it before she arrived, because he knew she was afraid of walking in the dark even though she never said so. When the heater in the room, she usually cleaned, stopped working, he had it replaced that same day with the most expensive model. And when she asked, he only said, maybe building management changed it. They both knew what the other was doing. They both pretended not to know. And that pretense, gentle, awkward, full of care, became the truest thing either of them had ever had with anyone. Their late-night conversations became a habit no one scheduled, but neither of them ever missed. Emilio came home. Phoebe was still cleaning, and somehow the two of them always ended up in the kitchen, him drinking whiskey, her drinking bottled tea from the dollar store, talking until the wall clock showed numbers they both knew were far too late. Phoebe told him about Ridgeway, about the smell of wet, rotting leaves after rain, about the only grocery store in town where the owner knew every child's name. Emilio listened, and every story she told felt like a window opening into a world he hadn't known existed. A world where people lived not for power or money, but simply because it was home. One night, while they sat in the kitchen and Emilio had just finished telling her about the first hotel his father had bought, Phoebe set down her tea, looked at him with the eyes he had taught himself not to look at for too long, because he was afraid he wouldn't be able to look away, and asked, "Are you happy?" 4 words. No one had asked Emilio Valerio that in 37 years. Conrad hadn't asked because he believed happiness was a luxury men didn't need. Felicity hadn't asked because she didn't care. His men hadn't asked because no one dared. But Phoebe asked, and she wasn't asking to be polite. She asked because she looked into his eyes every night and saw the thing he hid from the whole world but couldn't hide from her. "I don't know," he answered, and it was the most honest answer he had ever given anyone. Then came the January blizzard. Chicago disappeared under snow so deep the city shut down. The expressways turned into frozen white rivers that didn't move. Phoebe called the company, called neighbors, called anyone who might come pick her up, but no one could get out on the roads. Emilio said 2 words. "Stay here." Not an order, not a request, just 2 words spoken in the voice of a man who didn't want this house to be empty for one more night. Phoebe stayed. And that night, everything changed. Not in a dramatic moment, but in the quiet surrender of 2 people who had been lonely for too long, sitting beside each other in front of the fire while the storm howled outside, admitting that there was nowhere in the world either of them wanted to be more than exactly there. The 6 months that followed were the first 6 months Emilio Valerio had truly lived. He laughed, a sound even he didn't recognize when it came out of his own mouth. He cooked with Phoebe, burned 2 pans, and she laughed at him so hard she had to sit on the kitchen floor holding her stomach. He told her about the childhood dream he had never told anyone, that before Conrad taught him how to run an empire, he had wanted to build homes for the homeless, small homes, warm ones, with windows that looked out onto trees. Phoebe didn't laugh. She said, "Then build them. Who's stopping you?" And he looked at her as if she had just said the most extraordinary thing he had ever heard, when really, she had only spoken the simplest truth no one had ever dared say to him. Then, driven by a flicker of hope for a future with Phoebe, Emilio sought a follow-up confirmation. But those same 2 words from Dr. Hargrove, still infertile, arrived to destroy his spirit. Emilio withdrew into his old shell, colder and more distant than ever, because this reconfirmation made him believe his condition was an inescapable sentence. 3 days after the diagnosis, Phoebe sent a message. "I'm sorry, I can't stay. Please don't look for me." Emilio read that message 47 times. Each time, he searched for a word, a sign, some tiny opening that might explain why. On the 48th time, he hurled the phone against the wall of his office and watched it shatter into plastic and glass across the oak floor. He could have found her within 24 hours. Emilio Valerio controlled half of Chicago. He could find anyone, but he didn't look for her. Not because he couldn't, because what did a man who had just been told he couldn't create life have to offer the woman he loved? He wasn't worthy. That was what he believed. And he lived with that belief for the next 3.5 years, alone in the empty mansion, with his bottle of whiskey and the crack in the mirror. He didn't know that when Phoebe sent that message, there were already 3 hearts beating inside her. 3 weeks after sending that message, Phoebe sat in a free clinic in Humboldt Park, the kind of clinic with hard plastic waiting chairs and yellow paint peeling from the walls, the kind meant for people with no insurance and no other choice. She came because she had been vomiting constantly for 2 weeks and thought it was food poisoning or stress or both. The doctor on duty, a young woman who looked more exhausted than the patients, spread gel across Phoebe's stomach, pressed the ultrasound probe down, and went quiet for too long. Phoebe looked at the screen but understood nothing except the flickering bright spots. "There are 3 heartbeats," the doctor said. "You're pregnant with triplets." The room spun once. Phoebe gripped the edge of the bed, her nails digging into the thin sheet, and tried not to faint. 3. Not 1, not 2. 3 babies were growing inside her while she had no insurance, no permanent home, was sleeping on the floor of a $300 a month rented room on the west side, working 2 jobs, and didn't know the full name of the father of these children. She knew his gray eyes. She knew the rare sound of his laughter in the kitchen at midnight. She knew he liked black coffee with no sugar and read books at 3 in the morning, but she didn't know his last name, didn't know what he really did for a living, and didn't know what kind of life he lived beyond that house. She only knew he was the lonely man in the house that was too large, and now she carried 3 pieces of him inside her without his knowing it. A triplet pregnancy was the kind doctors called high risk from the very first appointment. By the 24th week, Phoebe began to develop preeclampsia, her blood pressure soaring, her vision blurring, her head aching as if someone were tightening a steel band around her skull. She was admitted to Stroger Hospital, the largest public hospital in Chicago, where the wards held 20 beds together and the nurses had to run across 4 floors because there weren't enough of them. She lay there for 6 weeks. 6 weeks staring at the white ceiling, listening to the monitors beep, hearing the woman in the next bed cry at midnight, and wondering whether the 3 babies inside her would live. No one came to visit, not because no one cared, but because Phoebe had no one who could come. Her mother was gone. Her father had been gone for even longer. No brothers or sisters, no close friend, no lover who knew she was here. She lay alone for 6 weeks, talking to the 3 unborn babies because that was the only way not to lose her mind. "Mama doesn't know your father's name," she whispered to her belly at 3 in the morning, when the whole ward was asleep. "But Mama knows your father is a good man. I can feel that. And you'll have your father's eyes. I'm sure of it." In the 32nd week, the doctors decided on an emergency delivery because one of the 3 babies was showing signs of fetal distress. Phoebe was wheeled into the public delivery room, where 12 other mothers were separated only by thin fabric curtains, and the labor lasted 14 hours. 14 hours with no one to hold her hand, no one to say, "Keep going." Only nurses changing shifts over and over, and the doctor's voice giving orders through the sound of machines. Colette was born first, so silent that Phoebe thought she had lost her child until a weak cry rose like the sound of a kitten. Margot was born 4 minutes later, crying louder, angrier, as if protesting being pulled from warmth. Flynn came last, the smallest, the quietest, and when the nurse laid him on Phoebe's chest for 30 seconds, before taking him to the neonatal intensive care unit, she saw that face and everything inside her broke open at once. Gray eyes, a tiny square chin, a crescent-shaped birthmark beneath the left ear. Flynn was a perfect miniature copy of the man she had left behind in the big house. "They have his eyes," she said to the nurse, her voice raw after 14 hours, and the nurse didn't understand what she meant, only patted her shoulder gently before wheeling the gurney away. The 3 babies stayed in the neonatal intensive care unit for 5 weeks. 5 weeks inside incubators, breathing through tubes, feeding through lines, so small that Phoebe's hand could cover the whole of each of their bodies. She came every day, sat between the 3 incubators, slipped her finger through the little opening in each wall to touch the tiny hand of each child, and sang the song her mother used to sing in Ridgeway, singing so softly that only she and they could hear it. When the babies were strong enough to be discharged, Phoebe signed the release papers and was handed a bill as thick as a novel, $340,000. She held the papers in both hands, read the number, then folded them and slipped them into her coat pocket because there was nothing else she could do with them. She pushed her 3 children out through the hospital gate in a stroller borrowed from the social work department, stepped into an August afternoon in Chicago with 3 tiny lives, a debt she would never be able to repay, and not a single dollar in her pocket. She held 3 children who carried the face of a man whose name she didn't know, in a hospital she couldn't afford, and wondered whether this was a gift or a punishment. The rented room on the west side lasted 4 months. The 3 newborns cried in shifts. When one stopped, another began, turning through the night like an alarm system with no off switch. Phoebe hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since the day she brought them home, but she could endure it, because she had learned how to endure long before she knew endurance was even a skill. The landlord wasn't built the same way. He knocked on her door at 6 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, eyes red, face tight with irritation, and said only one sentence: "I rent rooms. I don't run a daycare. You've got until the weekend to get out." Phoebe didn't beg. Her mother had taught her that begging only made the person throwing you out feel more entitled to do it. She packed everything into 2 black plastic bags, settled the 3 babies into a borrowed double stroller, and carried Flynn in her arms, then walked out. The old Honda Civic she had bought for $700 from a junkyard in Cicero became home. 3 weeks in the middle of a Chicago winter. The kind of winter the news called life-threatening and warned people to stay indoors for. At night, the temperature dropped to 15 below zero. Phoebe parked behind a Walmart on Pulaski Avenue, where the lights stayed on all night and security guards made regular rounds, so at least no one came pounding on the windows at midnight demanding money or trouble. She laid the 3 babies across the back seat, wrapped every blanket she had around them, ran the engine for heat, and sat in the driver's seat hugging her knees, shivering not because she was cold by nature, but because she had given every blanket to her children and had only a thin sweater on her own body. She cried, but not out loud, because if the 3 babies woke and saw their mother crying, then she would no longer be the last safe place they had. On the 21st night, at 2 a.m, someone knocked on the driver's side window. Phoebe jolted awake, heart racing, hands searching for anything she could use to defend herself. Outside stood an old woman in a heavy coat, silver hair tucked beneath a knit cap, a wrinkled face and pale blue eyes looking into the car with something Phoebe hadn't seen since her mother died. Real compassion, not the kind of pity that watches from a distance, but the kind that makes a person move. "Open the door, girl," the woman said. "My name's Agnes Murphy. I live in that building right there. I've seen this car parked here for 3 weeks. I don't know what's happened to you, but those 3 babies aren't sleeping in this car for one more night. Come with me." Agnes's apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building on North Springfield in Humboldt Park. 1 bedroom, 1 living room that doubled as a kitchen, hot in summer and cold in winter, even when the heat ran full blast. But it had walls, a roof, hot water, and Agnes, a 67-year-old Irish woman who had lived alone since her husband died 10 years earlier, with no children, no relatives, only an old cat, and an instinct that wouldn't let her leave anyone out in the freezing dark. Agnes watched the 3 babies at night so Phoebe could work, and Phoebe worked 3 jobs at once: cleaning houses during the day for the cleaning company, washing dishes in the evening at the Greek restaurant on Halsted Street, and stocking shelves at the Amazon warehouse in Joliet from 4 o'clock until 7 in the morning. She slept an average of 3 hours a day, split into 3 short bursts on buses and on Agnes's floor in the narrow spaces between shifts. Then Colette got sick. A fever of 104 degrees, cheeks flushed dark red, eyes dull, body limp as cloth. Phoebe called 911. Dispatch told her an ambulance was on the way, but Humboldt Park that night had 3 shootings and 2 traffic accidents, and the estimated wait time was 45 minutes. Phoebe looked at her daughter in her arms, felt the heat of the little body pressing through to her own chest, and made her decision in 2 seconds. She left Margot and Flynn with Agnes, wrapped Colette in every layer of fabric she could find, and stepped outside. 4 miles from Agnes's apartment to Stroger Hospital. 4 miles through a snowstorm, wind slicing across her face like knives, snow rising to her ankles, streets empty because no one sane enough would have gone out at that hour. Phoebe held Colette tight against her chest, lowered her head against the wind, and walked. She couldn't run for fear of slipping and hurting the baby. She couldn't stop for fear the little body would go cold. She walked for 1 hour and 45 minutes, reached the emergency entrance with shoes soaked through, both hands so numb she couldn't undo her own coat, and said to the intake nurse in a shredded voice, "My daughter. Fever. Please help." Colette was treated. It was only a respiratory infection, not life-threatening if it was caught in time. Phoebe sat in a plastic chair in the emergency room holding her daughter, legs still shaking from the cold, and for the first time thought of him. Not because she missed him, because she was angry. Angry that she didn't know his name to call it. Angry that he was somewhere in this city, maybe only a few miles away, and had no idea his daughter had nearly died. She tried to find him. She called the old cleaning company, but the number was no longer in service. The company had gone under. She didn't have his name, didn't have any address except the big house in Lake Forest, and she couldn't get there because her car couldn't make the trip in winter, and she didn't have the money for a 30-mile Uber. He was a ghost. The nameless man in the house too large for one life, the father of her 3 children, and she had no way to reach him even though he was less than an hour's drive away. 14 months after that snowstorm, the old cleaning company had already gone bankrupt, and Phoebe applied to a new one. On her first day, she read the address on the assignment sheet and went still. Lake Forest. She knew that house before she stepped inside. She recognized the iron gate, the stone drive, the line of maple trees on either side, and when the front door opened, the smell of oak and that same emptiness hit her like a blow. She almost turned around. But the company paid $18 an hour, more than any place she had ever worked, and 3 children needed food, milk, medicine, diapers, needed everything that $18 an hour could buy. So she stayed. She cleaned the house where she had once loved a man, wiped down the stairs where she had once lifted a broom handle and asked, "Who the hell are you?" And every time she opened the refrigerator and still found it empty, she knew he was living the same way, still alone, still not having found the thing she had carried away when she left this place. And that was why she was standing at the gate tonight, with 3 children, because Agnes had broken her hip. There was no one left to watch them, and Phoebe couldn't afford to lose one more day of wages. The living room lights came on, and both of them saw each other at the same moment. Phoebe stepped back once, her left hand covering her mouth, her right hand still holding Flynn tightly against her hip. Her eyes widened, not in fear, but in the kind of shock that makes the body forget how to react. It was him, the man in the big house, the man she had loved, had left, had searched for, and had never found. He was standing right here, in the very house she had just invited him into as if he were a stranger. But Emilio wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on Flynn, the little boy limp against Phoebe's shoulder, mouth slightly open, curls damp with sweat and rainwater. He had seen that face before. Not on the street, not in a dream, but in the black and white photograph on Conrad's desk, the one taken when Emilio was 2 years old sitting on his mother's lap, with the same gray eyes, the same square chin, the same crescent-shaped birthmark beneath the left ear. A perfect copy across 35 years. Emilio swallowed hard. His jaw tightened until the muscle at his temple twitched. He looked toward the 2 little girls sleeping on the sofa. Colette curled into herself, Margot holding her sister's arm, both of them carrying pieces of his face like proof no one needed a DNA test to recognize. "How old are they?" His voice was rough, low, as if the words had to claw their own way out of his throat. 2 years and 8 months, Phoebe answered. Emilio did the math, and the answer struck him like a hammer. 2 years and 8 months. She had left 3 years and 4 months ago. She had been pregnant when she sent that message. She had been pregnant when she wrote, "Please don't look for me." She had known, and she hadn't told him. "Why didn't you tell me?" Phoebe looked at him, and there was no guilt in her eyes, no shame, only the exhaustion of someone who had carried this answer for nearly 3 years and knew it wouldn't make anyone feel better. "Because I didn't know your name. I didn't know who you were. I only knew you were the lonely man in the big house, and I had no way to find you." Every word was a bullet Emilio couldn't dodge, because she wasn't missing. She was telling the truth. He had hidden his identity so carefully that the woman carrying his children hadn't been able to find him even though she had been less than 30 miles away in the same city. He had built the walls around his life so high that he had trapped himself inside them. And while he had been sitting alone at 2 a.m. drinking whiskey and feeling sorry for himself over the 2 words infertile spoken by a doctor, she had been carrying his 3 children 4 miles through a snowstorm to a hospital. Emilio lifted a hand to cover his eyes. It wasn't the gesture a mafia boss was supposed to make. It wasn't what Conrad had taught him, but he couldn't control it. Because every second he stood in that room, looking at 3 children with his face, he was counting the nights they had slept in a car through winter, while he had slept in a king-sized bed in a 400-square-meter house, and believed he was the most pitiful man in the world. A small sound pulled him out of the spiral of thought. Flynn was awake. The little boy shifted against Phoebe's hip, opened his eyes, looked around the unfamiliar living room, and then those storm-gray eyes landed on Emilio. Flynn looked at him. Emilio looked back, and then the child lifted both arms, his tiny hands opening wide, asking to be held. No one told him to do that. No one taught him that the man standing there was his father, but something in blood, in bone, in the way biology recognizes itself, made Flynn reach for Emilio as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Phoebe looked at her son, then at Emilio, and she didn't say a word, only passed Flynn into his arms. Emilio took the child with the same hands that, only hours earlier, had signed orders on a $5 million deal. Flynn laid his head on Emilio's shoulder, tucked his face into his neck, and fell asleep again within 30 seconds, as quickly as if this were the safest place in the world, as quickly as if he had been waiting to be here for 2 years and 8 months. Emilio Valerio cried, not the way men cry in films, not beautiful tears sliding down his cheek. He cried like a 37-year-old man who hadn't cried in 20 years and no longer knew how to stop. Shoulders shaking, jaw clenched, breath breaking apart, one arm wrapped around his son, the other gripping the back of the sofa because he was afraid his knees would give out. He cried because these 3 children existed, because he wasn't infertile, because everything he had believed for nearly 3 years was a lie, because while he had thought he couldn't create life, life had been sleeping in a car through winter, because their father had hidden his name too well. When he had calmed enough for his voice to stop shaking, he looked at Phoebe. She was standing beside the sofa, one hand resting on Margot's sleeping back, eyes red but dry, because she had already cried enough, had cried for both of them for nearly 3 years. "Stay," he said. "You and the children. Don't disappear again." "I'm not a charity case," Phoebe replied, her back straight, her chin lifted, the same posture she had carried from the night she slept in the car to the night she walked through the snowstorm, the posture of someone who wouldn't bow even if both legs were broken. "This isn't charity," Emilio said. "This is me asking the mother of my children to let me be their father." Phoebe was silent for a moment. She looked at Flynn asleep on his shoulder, looked at Colette and Margot on the sofa, then looked back at Emilio with the eyes he had remembered for 2.5 years, and that were now here, real, less than an arm's length away. She nodded. She stayed. But in the mansion's security camera system, the system Grant Kensington had hacked 6 months earlier, every moment that had just happened was being recorded, from Emilio's tears to Flynn's tiny hands reaching to be held, from the words "Don't disappear again" to Phoebe's nod. And somewhere in a penthouse on the Magnificent Mile, Grant Kensington sat in front of a screen, replaying the sight of his boss crying beside 3 children, and smiled. The next morning, before Phoebe and the children woke, Emilio sat in his study and called the only man he could trust with this. Dr. Samuel Oates, 60 years old, Emilio's personal physician since Emilio had still been a teenager running the streets of the South Side, was the man who had stitched the first knife wound on his arm when he was 14 and hadn't asked a single question. Oates belonged to no family, owed no one, feared no one, and that was exactly why Emilio needed him. "I need another fertility test. Completely confidential. Not through a hospital, not through insurance, and my name doesn't go on a single piece of paper. What happened? I've got 3 children I didn't know about for almost 3 years, Samuel, and I need to know whether the result Hargrove gave me was ever the truth." 3 seconds of silence passed on the other end of the line. Then Oates said, "Come to my private clinic in Lincoln Park this afternoon. I'll arrange it." 2 days later, the results came back. Oates called Emilio to the clinic, shut the door, sat down across from him, and opened the file. "Your sperm is completely normal. Count, morphology, motility, all of it is within a healthy range." Emilio, you were never infertile. The result Hargrove gave you was wrong, or it was falsified. Emilio sat still. No reaction. No clenched fists. No grinding jaw. He only looked at the papers in front of him and felt something colder than anger spread from his chest down into his stomach. The kind of cold that belongs to a man who has just realized he was stabbed in the back, but doesn't know whose hand held the knife. I need one more thing, he said. A DNA test. Me and the 3 children. Oates nodded and didn't ask another question. A week later, the DNA results came back. 99.99%. All 3 children were Emilio Valerio's biological children. There was nothing left to doubt. Flynn, Colette, and Margot were his blood, his bone. Living proof that someone had lied to him, had stolen almost 3 years that should have been his to spend as their father, had forced the woman he loved to raise 3 children alone in a car through winter. Now Emilio needed to know who. And the answer came from the last person he expected. Yelena Petrova knocked on the study door one evening after Phoebe had taken the children upstairs to sleep. She stepped inside, placed a small external hard drive no bigger than a palm on the desk, and sat down in the chair across from him with the calm of someone who had been holding this secret long enough. I found this in Grant's safe at Valerio Tower, Yelena said. I clean his office every week. He never thought the cleaning woman would notice the code to his safe. But I noticed. I notice everything. Emilio looked at her, looked at the hard drive, then looked back at her. How long have you known? I've known Grant's been meeting Victoria Ashford for 6 months. I didn't know why until I opened this. Emilio plugged the drive into his laptop. Inside was only one folder, labeled Insurance, the kind of name a man hiding secrets chooses when he wants to protect himself. Inside the folder was a single audio file, 14 minutes long. Emilio pressed play. Victoria Ashford's voice filled the room, sharp, clear, unapologetic. The result has to be infertility, Philip. No exceptions. I need this marriage to end in a way that doesn't place the blame on Felicity. Dr. Hargrove's voice came next, more hesitant, but still willing. You understand this is serious medical fraud. I understand that $500,000 will be transferred into your Cayman Islands account before Friday. Do you understand that, Philip? I understand. Emilio listened to all 14 minutes. He listened to Victoria instruct Hargrove on how to fake the results. Listened to Hargrove ask twice about the money. Listened to Victoria end the call with the words, "Don't call me back on this number. Delete the history." The file ended. The study fell silent. Yelena sat across from him and waited. Emilio didn't slam the desk. He didn't shout. He didn't stand and flip a chair or hurl a bottle at the wall the way he had in the past when a deal collapsed or a traitor was exposed. He only sat there, one hand resting on the desk, eyes fixed on the dark screen, and said in a voice so even that Yelena, a woman who had lived in this world for 30 years, felt a chill crawl up her spine. Now I know the price they put on my right to be a father. $500,000. Good. Now I know. He understood why Grant had kept that recording. Not for justice. For blackmail. Grant had proof that Victoria had committed a crime, and Victoria had the money and power Grant wanted. 2 traitors, each holding a knife to the other's throat, neither daring to lower a hand, because each knew the other would drag them to death together, and both of them believed Emilio knew nothing. You keep this between you and me, Emilio said to Yelena. You tell no one, not even my father. Not yet. Yelena nodded, stood, and left the room without a sound. The way she had moved through this world for 30 years without anyone ever noticing, Emilio remained there alone. He didn't rush. In his world, the one who struck first was usually the one who lost. He would gather more. He would wait. He would strike once, at the right moment, in the right place. At every person who had taken nearly 3 years from him, all at once. But what Emilio didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know while sitting there planning perfect revenge, was that Grant Kensington was watching him too. Emilio called Conrad on Saturday morning and said only one sentence. I'll come to your house this afternoon. I'm bringing someone you need to meet. Conrad didn't ask another question, because he had lived long enough in this world to know that the tone in his son's voice wasn't the tone of a man who wanted to talk, but the tone of a man who was about to change everything. Conrad's Gold Coast mansion stood on Astor Street, the kind of house that made passers-by lift their heads to take it all in. 3 stories of gray limestone, iron-framed glass windows, and a living room so vast that footsteps echoed through it like a church. Conrad was standing by the window looking out at the garden when Emilio walked in, and he turned around with the expression of a man prepared for any kind of news. A new territorial war, a betrayal, a number representing losses that had to be dealt with. He wasn't prepared for 3 children. Phoebe came in behind Emilio, carrying Flynn in her arms, while Colette and Margot walked at her sides holding onto her skirt. The 3 children looked around the enormous room with wide, round eyes, and when Conrad saw them, the silver cane in his hand, the one he had carried for 10 years since his right knee had begun to fail him, slipped from his fingers and struck the wooden floor with a sharp knock that rang through the silence. He didn't pick it up. He stood there, 70 years old, his back still straight but his eyes no longer hard, looking at Flynn, then Colette, then Margot, then Flynn again, and each time he looked he saw another piece of a puzzle that made his knees want to buckle. The gray eyes, the square chin, the way Flynn tilted his head when he was curious. Exactly the way Emilio had at 2 years old, in the black and white photograph Conrad had kept on his desk for 35 years. He sank into the leather chair behind him, heavily, as if someone had just pulled the bones out of his legs. "My God," he whispered. Flynn, who didn't know what fear was, just like his father in that way, wriggled free from Phoebe's arms, ran to where the silver cane lay on the floor, picked it up with both hands, and looked at the old man in the chair with the same gray eyes Conrad had seen in the mirror for 70 years. "Can I play with your cane, sir?" Flynn asked in a tiny voice. Conrad Valerio, the Mafia boss who had made half of Chicago tremble for 4 decades, the man who didn't cry at his wife's funeral, didn't cry when he was shot in the shoulder in 1992, hadn't cried once in 70 years except for the day Emilio was born, looked at the grandson he never knew existed, standing there holding his silver cane, and tears ran down both wrinkled cheeks without asking permission. "They look exactly like you did when you were little," he said to Emilio, his voice breaking in the middle. "If your mother were still alive, she would." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They both knew exactly what Emilio's mother, the woman who had died when Emilio was 12, would have done if she had seen these 3 grandchildren. She would have held them and never let go. Emilio waited until his father had steadied himself, then placed the folder on the coffee table. The new test from Dr. Oates, proving he was completely healthy. The old test from Dr. Hargrove declaring him infertile. The DNA results confirming 99.99%. And finally, the 14-minute recording between Victoria Ashford and Dr. Hargrove, along with proof that $500,000 had been transferred into a Cayman account. Conrad read every page, slowly, carefully. His hand began to shake by the 3rd page. Not with weakness, but with the kind of anger only an old man could feel, the kind of anger that comes when a man realizes he has been deceived by the very people he allowed into his family. When he reached the recording and heard Victoria say, $500,000 into the Cayman account before Friday, Conrad slammed his fist down onto the oak coffee table. The sound cracked through the room. Colette flinched. Margot, who had been sitting on the floor playing with the fringe of a throw blanket, let out a startled scream and burst into tears. Conrad froze. He looked at his granddaughter crying, and something in him changed at that very moment, so fast that even he didn't understand it in time to name it. He rose from the chair, slowly because of his knee, walked over to Margot, and knelt down. Both 70-year-old knees touched the wooden floor, and he didn't care about the pain. He held out both hands, awkwardly, uncertainly, exactly the way a man who had never held children before would hold them out. And Margot, her eyes still wet, looked at this silver-haired old man for a moment, then crawled into his lap. Conrad held her. The first time he had held a child since Emilio was a little boy, and he did it all wrong. Too tight, too stiff, too much force. But Margot didn't complain, only tucked her head against his chest and stopped crying. Emilio looked at his father holding his daughter and felt something crack open in his chest. Not pain, but the kind of relief that comes when a wall has stood too long and finally falls. "What do you need me to do?" Conrad asked, his voice still rough, Margot still in his arms. "I don't need your money," Emilio said. "I need you to promise me one thing. Be their grandfather. A real grandfather. Not the kind who sits in a chair giving orders. The kind who sits on the floor and plays with blocks." Conrad looked at his son, looked at Margot in his lap, looked at Flynn using his silver cane like a sword to fight imaginary enemies, looked at Colette standing beside Phoebe, watching everything with the same quiet gray eyes her father had. "I promise," he said, and he kept that promise. That afternoon, Conrad Valerio, the former mafia boss who had once made half of Chicago shake, sat on the floor of the Gold Coast mansion building blocks with his 3 grandchildren. Flynn built towers, knocked them down, laughed, then built them again. Colette arranged each piece carefully by color. Margot sat in his lap and refused to leave, her little hand wrapped tightly around one of his fingers, as if she were afraid he might disappear. And when Margot looked up at him and smiled, a smile for no reason except that she was happy, Conrad Valerio realized it was the most beautiful sound he had heard in 70 years. Phoebe chose the smallest room in the mansion, the one at the end of the second-floor hallway that Yelena had once used to store linens, just large enough for 1 double bed and 3 cribs lined up shoulder to shoulder. Emilio offered her the master suite, and she refused. He offered the larger guest room on the first floor, and she refused that too. He even offered, at the very least, to buy 3 new cribs, and she looked at him with the expression he was beginning to learn meant, "Don't keep going." "I'm not a kept woman," she said on that first Monday morning as she put on her cleaning company uniform and prepared to leave the house. "I'm a working mother." She kept cleaning other people's homes, because it was the only way she knew to look at herself in the mirror each morning without feeling as though she owed anyone anything. Emilio didn't argue, but he didn't sit still either. 2 weeks after Phoebe moved in, he called Stroger Hospital, asked for the full amount of debt under Phoebe Langdon's name, and paid it all in a single transfer. $340,000. To the Valerio empire, it was the kind of money one of their casinos spent on a year-end party. To Phoebe, it was the rock she had carried on her back for nearly 3 years, the burden she had already accepted she would carry for the rest of her life. She found out when a letter arrived from Stroger, a white envelope, 1 single line inside. "Your account has been paid in full. Current balance, $0. She read it 3 times. Then she walked straight to Emilio's study, placed the letter on his desk, and looked at him with burning eyes. "You had no right," she said, her voice shaking, not from weakness, but from anger. "That was my debt. That was the debt for my children being born," Emilio replied without lifting his eyes from the papers in front of him. "I paid what I owed." Phoebe stood there for another 10 seconds, her jaw locked tight, then turned and walked away. She didn't say thank you. Emilio didn't wait for her to say it. They both understood this wasn't about money. It was about who was allowed to protect whom, and Phoebe wasn't ready to let anyone protect her after nearly 3 years of protecting herself alone. Meanwhile, Emilio Valerio learned how to be a father in a way no book could teach. Flynn climbed onto the conference table at Valerio Tower one Wednesday afternoon in the middle of a meeting with 12 captains, discussing a new shipping route through the port of Milwaukee. Emilio had brought his son with him because Phoebe was working the afternoon shift, and Agnes was still wearing a cast, and he had thought letting the boy play in the next room would be fine. He was wrong. Flynn opened the meeting room door, walked into the middle of the 12 most dangerous men in the Midwest, climbed onto a chair, climbed onto the table, stood in the center of the map spread across the polished wood, and pointed at the Great Lakes with 1 tiny finger. Map. Such a big map. The 12 captains froze. No one moved. No one even breathed too hard. All of them looked at Emilio, waiting for his reaction, because in that room the boss decided everything, even what to do when a 2.5-year-old child had just interrupted a meeting worth millions of dollars. Emilio stood, walked to the table, lifted Flynn into his arms, settled him against his left side, and pointed at the map with his right hand. "This is Chicago. This is Detroit. This is Milwaukee. The 3 most important cities for Daddy." Flynn listened with complete attention as if he were absorbing business strategy, then pointed at Lake Michigan and asked, "Are there fish?" "Yes," Emilio answered. "A lot of fish." Not one of the captains laughed, but when Emilio carried his son out of the room, every man there watched him with a look none of them had ever given the boss before. Not fear, but something closer to respect. 2 weeks later, Colette had a fever at 2 a.m. Emilio was in the study when Phoebe called for him. He went upstairs and found Colette lying in her crib, cheeks blazing red, her breathing quick and shallow. He scooped up his daughter, wrapped her in a blanket, ran to the garage, and drove the Bentley at 120 miles an hour down the highway at midnight to Northwestern Memorial. In the emergency room, he sat holding Colette on a plastic chair, his hands trembling, his eyes never leaving her. And when the doctor came back after 45 minutes of tests and said, "It's only an ear infection. Nothing serious," Emilio nodded calmly, thanked the doctor, carried his daughter into the hallway, then leaned his head against the wall and couldn't breathe properly for 2 whole minutes. He had once been shot in the shoulder without flinching. He had once sat across from a steel crate full of weapons in a $20 million deal and not felt his heartbeat rise even once. But his daughter had a fever, and he nearly fell apart. Then came the afternoon when Margot changed everything. She was the quietest of the 3, the one who watched, the one who often sat still and studied everyone with her wide eyes as if she were storing the whole world in memory. Emilio was sitting on the sofa reading a financial report on his laptop when Margot crawled over, tugged at his pant leg, looked up at him, and said, "Daddy." One word, the first word any child had ever used to call him by that name. Emilio closed the laptop, lifted his daughter into his arms, sat on that sofa the entire afternoon doing nothing except holding Margot while she played with the buttons on his shirt. Yelena passed by, saw the scene, and turned away before Emilio could catch the smile on her face. But beneath all those warm moments, something was changing between Emilio and Phoebe, and not in a direction either of them wanted. She began to notice details that didn't fit. The midnight calls he stepped out of the room to answer. Yelena opening the door for men in black suits, who came and went without explanation. The safe in his study that he opened with his fingerprint, and locked again the moment she came too close. And one night, when she entered the study looking for a book for Colette, she saw the leather holster on the desk, partly open, and inside it a black handgun, gleaming and heavy. She didn't scream, she didn't run. She stood there looking at the gun, then looked around the room, and saw this house, this life, this man, through completely different eyes. That night, after the children were asleep, she sat across from Emilio in the kitchen and asked him directly, "Who are you? Really?" And Emilio, because she deserved to know, told her the truth. Phoebe listened to every word. She didn't interrupt. She didn't stand up and walk out. When he finished, she sat in silence for a very long time, then said in a voice he wished she had shouted instead, "So I fell in love with exactly the kind of man my mother always warned me about." She stood, went back to her room, and closed the door softly. She didn't slam it. Softly. And that soft click of the door hurt more than any bullet Emilio had ever taken. The 2 of them lived only a hallway apart, closer than anyone else in either of their lives, and yet farther from each other than ever before, because now she knew who he really was, and that changed everything. While Emilio was learning how to be a father and Phoebe was learning how to live with the truth about the man she loved, Grant Kensington sat in his penthouse on the Magnificent Mile and replayed every second of footage from the Lake Forest Mansion security system. Grant knew he was racing against time. Emilio already had proof of the falsified fertility test, already had the recording of Victoria and Hargrove, and sooner or later he would trace the link between Grant and Victoria. Grant needed to strike first, not with 1 blow, but with 3 at the same time, enough to leave Emilio unable to know which way to defend himself. The first strike was the FBI. Grant used a prepaid phone to call the anonymous tip line for the Chicago FBI office, disguising his voice, and gave them information that the Lake Forest Mansion was being used to store documents connected to money laundering through the Valerio casino system. The information was specific enough that the FBI couldn't ignore it, but vague enough that it couldn't lead back to Grant. 2 days later, Emilio received a call from Reed Galloway, the family lawyer, 42 years old, sharp as a scalpel, and loyal enough to have turned down triple the salary from 3 of the biggest law firms in Chicago in order to stay with the Valerios. "The FBI has opened a preliminary investigation into the Lake Forest Mansion," Reed said. "There isn't a search warrant yet, but they're applying for one." Someone tipped them off. The second strike came that same week. Victoria Ashford, still unaware that Grant was holding the recording of her crime as blackmail material, hired one of Chicago's top family law firms to pressure CPS into opening an investigation into Phoebe Langdon. The complaint was 30 pages thick, listing every detail. A mother who had once been homeless, had once lived in a car with 3 newborns, had no health insurance, owed hundreds of thousands in hospital debt, had no stable income, had no degree, and was now living in the home of a man under FBI investigation. Every fact in the complaint was true, and that was what made it dangerous, because Victoria wasn't inventing anything. She was only arranging the truth in a way that made Phoebe look like the worst mother in America. The third strike came from Felicity Ashford, now remarried and living in New York, who suddenly filed for visitation rights in Cook County Family Court as Emilio's former legal wife. She didn't want custody. She only needed to create one more legal front. Enough to force Emilio and his lawyers to divide their strength in 3 directions at once. Reed Galloway came to the Lake Forest mansion on Friday night, set 3 folders on the kitchen table, and looked at Emilio with eyes that in 20 years of practicing law for the underworld had never once shown worry. "They aren't trying to win one case," Reed said. "They're trying to drown you in 3 at once. The FBI creates criminal pressure. CPS threatens custody, and Felicity opens another front in family court. Each case by itself is manageable. All 3 at once, with the same target, are designed to break you." Phoebe sat in the corner of the kitchen and listened to everything. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She only asked one question. "When will CPS come?" "Within a week," Reed answered. "They'll interview you at home, inspect the living conditions, and talk to the children if they're old enough to respond. You need to stay calm, answer honestly, and not let them see any sign of instability." "I raised 3 children alone in a car during a Chicago winter," Phoebe said, her voice flat and steady. "I think I can handle an interview." The CPS workers arrived on Wednesday afternoon, 2 of them, 1 man and 1 woman, their name badges clipped to their shirt pockets, their faces professionally blank. They inspected every room, opened the refrigerator, full of food, opened the children's closet, neat and clean, checked the 3 cribs, clean sheets, no stains, asked Phoebe about the children's feeding schedule, sleeping schedule, medical appointments. Phoebe answered every question in a clear voice, without stumbling, without becoming overly defensive, without showing anger even though she had every reason in the world to be angry. She handed them the children's health records, regular monthly visits at Dr. Oates's clinic. She handed them receipts for food, diapers, milk, medicine. She gave them Agnes Murphy's phone number as a reference. The female CPS worker watched Flynn playing on the floor, Colette sitting with a picture book, Margot asleep on the sofa with her head resting on Phoebe's leg. She wrote something down on the assessment form, and when they left, the male worker said to Phoebe, "We'll send the report within 2 weeks, but from what I've seen today, you don't have anything to worry about." Phoebe closed the door, leaned her back against it, and shut her eyes for 3 seconds. Only 3 seconds. Then she opened them, straightened her back, and went into the kitchen to prepare dinner for the children, because life didn't stop so she could catch her breath. Emilio stood in the hallway watching her, and inside his chest something tightened, not from pain, but because he saw in Phoebe something he had never seen in anyone inside his empire, courage that didn't need a gun. But Grant's real plan wasn't to take the children or send Emilio to prison. The 3 legal fronts were only noise, only smoke, only a screen. The real target was to pull Emilio out of the fortress, away from the mansion with cameras, bodyguards, high walls, and locked gates, into an open place where 3 small, gray-eyed, curly-haired children would become the perfect bait to lead the boss exactly where Grant wanted him. The family court hearing at the Cook County Courthouse was scheduled for Tuesday of the 3rd week of the month. Courtroom 7, 6th floor, the kind of small courtroom reserved for domestic disputes, where the judge sat only half a meter above everyone else. Yet that distance was enough to decide who got to keep a child and who did not. Felicity Ashford arrived with her lawyer from New York, wearing a pale gray dress, her hair swept into a neat knot, in high heels that cost as much as 2 months of Phoebe's wages. Victoria sat in the back row, her spine straight, her face unreadable, one hand resting on her handbag as if she were attending a concert instead of a hearing she herself had orchestrated. Phoebe sat beside Emilio in the only navy dress she owned, the one she had bought on clearance at Target 3 years earlier for her first job interview in Chicago. She wore no jewelry, no makeup except a little lipstick Agnes had pressed into her hand that morning, saying, "For confidence." But she sat with her back straight and her chin lifted, and when her eyes met Victoria Ashford's across the courtroom, she didn't look away. Felicity's lawyer spoke first. The petition for visitation rights was built on the claim that Felicity had once been Emilio's legal wife, and therefore had a vested interest in any children born during or shortly after the marriage. The lawyer used the phrase unstable environment 7 times in 15 minutes, mentioned Phoebe's history of homelessness, mentioned the open FBI investigation, and referred to the fact that the 3 children were now living in the home of a man with a documented history connected to activities outside the framework of the law. Reed Galloway rose, and countered by refusing to dispute anything opposing counsel had said. Instead, he opened a folder and presented the judge with the evidence of medical fraud. The old test from Dr. Hargrove declaring Emilio infertile. The new test from Dr. Oates, proving the opposite. The DNA results confirming that the 3 children were biologically his. And the 14-minute recording between Victoria Ashford and Dr. Philip Hargrove, in which Victoria ordered the falsification of the results and arranged for $500,000 to be transferred into a Cayman Islands account. The courtroom fell silent when the recording was played through the speakers. Victoria's voice rang out clearly, every word sharp, cold, and undisguised. Emilio looked at Victoria while the recording played and saw her sitting perfectly still, only her fingers tightening around the handle of her handbag until the knuckles turned white. Dr. Hargrove was called in through video link because he refused to appear in court in person. On the screen, he was sweating, his eyes darting from side to side. And when Reed asked him directly, "Did you accept money from Victoria Ashford to falsify Emilio Valerio's fertility test results?" Hargrove was silent for 4 seconds before saying, "It was a professional error in the evaluation process." Reed didn't shout, didn't slam the table. He simply opened his laptop and projected onto the courtroom screen the Cayman Islands account statement traced by Valerio's financial team, clearly showing a transfer of $500,000 from a shell company linked to the Ashford family into an account in Hargrove's name, exactly 2 days before he delivered the infertility diagnosis. "A professional error worth $500,000, Reed said. "The most expensive one in medical history." The judge took note. Then Reed called his witnesses. Agnes Murphy, 67 years old, walked to the witness stand in sneakers and the oldest coat that courtroom had probably ever seen. She sat down, adjusted the microphone, and spoke in the clear voice of a woman who didn't know how to speak in circles. "I found her sleeping in a car with 3 newborn babies in January. 15 below zero. She had wrapped every blanket she had around those children. She was wearing nothing but a sweater. In 67 years on this earth, I've never seen anybody love her children the way she does. If this court calls that an unfit mother, then I don't know what a good mother looks like anymore." The courtroom stayed quiet. The court reporter missed a beat before continuing to type. Conrad Valerio was called next. He stepped to the stand with his silver cane, sat down, looked straight at the judge, and spoke in a trembling voice that everyone in the room understood was not trembling from weakness. "She's stronger than all of us. She raised my 3 grandchildren alone, without a single dollar from this family, without one complaint. I failed my son. She didn't fail her children." He paused, swallowed hard, and then added, "I'm an old man who's made more mistakes than I can count. But if this court asks me who I trust most in this world to care for my 3 grandchildren, the answer is Phoebe Langdon. Not my son, not me, her." The judge didn't need much time. She read the ruling after 20 minutes of deliberation. Felicity Ashford's petition for visitation rights was dismissed in full for lack of legal basis. Felicity was not the biological mother, and her marriage to Emilio had ended before the 3 children were born. The CPS report was entered into the record, with no findings of any violation regarding living conditions or child care, and the evidence of medical fraud would be forwarded to the prosecutor's office for consideration of criminal charges against Dr. Philip Hargrove. When Phoebe walked out of the courtroom, moving down the courthouse corridor with her shoes clicking over the granite floor, she reached her left hand out and took Emilio's. She didn't look at him, didn't say a word. She only held on. It was the first time she had reached for him since the night she learned he was a mafia boss. Emilio felt her small, calloused, warm hand in his, and closed his fingers around it gently, as if he feared that holding too tightly might make her change her mind. They stepped out into the Chicago sunlight, and in that moment, with her hand in his and the sound of the ruling still echoing in his ears, Emilio almost believed that the worst had passed. But that victory lasted exactly 72 hours. 3 days after the court hearing, on a Tuesday morning that was bright and cold, Phoebe bundled the 3 children into their coats and told Emilio she was taking them to Millennium Park. Emilio offered a private car with a driver and 2 bodyguards. Phoebe refused. He offered at least 1 SUV following at a safe distance. She refused again. In the end, she agreed to a single bodyguard staying 50 meters behind her, far enough that the children wouldn't know they were being watched, close enough to intervene if necessary. "My children deserve 1 normal Tuesday," she said, and Emilio didn't argue further because he knew she was right, that if he turned their lives into a fortress, then they would grow up inside a prison wrapped in velvet, and that wasn't the life any child deserved. He was wrong to agree. The bodyguard's name was Danny, 32 years old, a former Marine, loyal and capable. But Grant Kensington had watched the mansion long enough through the hacked security system to know the schedule, know the habits, know that Phoebe always took the children out in the morning after the hearing because she needed air and the children needed sunlight. Grant had handled Danny before Danny ever saw the park. 2 black sedans boxed Danny in at an intersection 2 blocks before Millennium Park, one in front and one behind, pinning him in place. And when Danny reached for his gun, his car door had already been opened from the outside. Phoebe knew nothing. She was sitting on the grass near Cloud Gate, Flynn chasing pigeons, Colette sitting beside her mother turning the pages of a picture book, Margot lying on the picnic blanket looking at the clouds. One normal Tuesday morning. Until it wasn't. 2 men came from behind, quick, silent, professional. One lifted Flynn off the grass while he was running, covering his mouth before he could scream. The second yanked Colette from where she sat, tucked her under one arm, and both of them sprinted toward a black van already waiting on Michigan Avenue with its back door open. Phoebe reacted before her mind could even process what was happening. She ran after them, barefoot, because she had taken off her shoes while sitting on the grass, sprinting over the freezing concrete sidewalk, screaming in a voice that bystanders later described to police as not sounding human. The man carrying Flynn turned and shoved her to the pavement. Her knees slammed into the concrete, skin tearing open, blood seeping out. But she didn't feel pain, only the fact that her hand was still clamped around Margot. Because when the 2 men had charged in, her first instinct had been to grab the nearest child and never let go, and Margot had been the one in her lap. The van doors slammed shut. Tires screamed. It disappeared into traffic on Michigan Avenue. Flynn and Colette were gone. Phoebe sat on the sidewalk, blood on her knees, Margot screaming in her arms, and the world narrowed to one single point. 2 of her children had just been torn from her in broad daylight. She called 911. Then she called Emilio. He answered after 1 ring. Phoebe's voice on the other end didn't shake, didn't cry, didn't scream. It was colder than any voice Emilio had ever heard, colder than his own voice when ordering a traitor dealt with, so cold it made his spine turn to ice. They took Colette and Flynn. I kept Margot. You've got 24 hours before I go after my children myself by any means necessary. I don't need you to be a mafia boss. I need you to be their father. Emilio didn't say a word. He ended the call, and in the next 60 seconds, he made 12 calls. Every captain, every set of eyes and ears on the street, every camera the Valerio Empire controlled or could reach anywhere in Chicago. The order was only 1 sentence. Find my children. If anyone gets in the way, deal with them. The next 18 hours were 18 hours in which Emilio Valerio didn't eat, didn't drink, didn't sit down. He stood in the war room at Valerio Tower, an enlarged map of Chicago spread across 3 screens, phones ringing without pause, and with every hour that passed without news, he felt the human part of himself being replaced by something darker, more dangerous, something he had put away the first time he held Flynn in his arms. Yelena was the one who found them. She tracked the GPS of the vehicle Grant often used, a black Range Rover registered under a shell company, and discovered it had moved to an abandoned warehouse district on the south side, near the old docks on Stony Island Avenue. Emilio went there with 6 men. No police, no FBI, only the law of the world he ruled. A gray concrete warehouse, rusted iron doors, yellow light leaking through broken window slats. Inside, Grant Kensington stood in the middle of the room, both hands in his coat pockets, calm as if he had been waiting for exactly the right man to arrive at exactly the right moment. Colette sat on a folding chair, silent, eyes wide but not crying, both hands gripping the hem of Flynn's shirt. Flynn sat beside her, face red from having cried for a long time, but now he had stopped, as if he had run out of tears. "You've gone weak, Emilio," Grant said, his voice still carrying the smile Emilio had once believed belonged to a brother. "A boss isn't allowed to love anyone." Emilio looked at his children, looked at Colette, silent and brave like her mother, looked at Flynn, exhausted but still clutching his sister. Then he looked back at Grant. "You're wrong. Before I had children, I fought for power. Now I fight for a reason, and a man who fights for a reason doesn't lose." What happened next unfolded quickly and quietly, the way this world handled everything. When it was over, Emilio carried Flynn in his left arm, held Colette's hand with his right, and walked out of the warehouse into the Chicago night air. Flynn wrapped both arms around his neck, buried his face in Emilio's shoulder, and said in a tiny, hoarse voice, "Daddy came." Colette said nothing. She only held on to Emilio's finger and wouldn't let go. All the way home, all the way back to the mansion, all the way through, Phoebe collapsing onto the living room floor and crying as she held all 3 children at once. All the way through the next 3 hours until Colette finally fell asleep, her little fingers still curled around her father's. Grant Kensington disappeared from Chicago after that night. No one found him. No one asked. That night, when all 3 children were asleep in the big bed, Flynn holding Colette, Colette holding Margot, Margot holding a pillow, Phoebe stood in the doorway looking at them, then turned and looked at Emilio standing behind her in the hallway. She looked at him with the eyes he had learned to read. But this time, he saw something she had never shown him before. Not gratitude, not relief, but recognition. The recognition that she had been wrong when she thought he was the kind of man her mother had warned her about. "You're not what my mother warned me about," she said. "You're what she prayed for." 2 months after the rescue, on a Saturday morning in September, Emilio told Phoebe to wear something comfortable and get in the car, without saying where they were going. She asked 3 times, and he didn't answer, only said, "Trust me." The 3 children were left with Conrad and Yelena at the Gold Coast mansion, and when the Bentley left Chicago heading south on Interstate 57, Phoebe looked out the window and saw the city grow smaller and then disappear, replaced by cornfields and soybean fields stretching all the way to the horizon. And she knew. She knew before he said anything. Before the sign reading, "Welcome to Ridgeway," appeared by the road. Before he turned onto the dirt path leading to the small cemetery behind the Baptist church, where her mother lay beneath a simple gravestone marked with a name and 2 dates, with no quote, no eulogy, only weeds growing around it because there was no one left to pull them up. Emilio stopped the car, stepped out, opened the door for her, then took her hand and walked with her through the rows of gravestones until they stood before her mother's grave. Phoebe looked at the stone and felt the ground beneath her feet become more real than any place she had stood in over the past 3 years, because this was where she began, where her mother had taught her everything that later kept her alive. Emilio knelt down. Not before Phoebe. He knelt before the gravestone, both knees touching the damp earth, and said, "I didn't ask her. I'm asking you. Because you raised the most extraordinary woman I've ever known." He opened his palm. Resting, there was a silver ring, not diamond, not white gold, just pure silver, simple, with 3 small stones set side by side on its face, 1 pale blue for Colette, 1 pale pink for Margot, 1 gray for Flynn. "Phoebe Langdon, will you marry me?" Phoebe looked at the ring, looked at the 3 little stones, then looked at him kneeling in the dirt before her mother's grave, in a suit that probably cost as much as Agnes's whole apartment, and she cried, not because she was sad, because he understood. "You know I hate expensive things," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "That's why I'm giving you the most expensive thing I have, a promise." She pulled him to his feet, placed her hands on both sides of his face, and said yes in the voice she wished her mother could hear. The wedding was held 6 weeks later at the Lake Forest mansion, the same place where 2 years earlier Phoebe had once wiped the stairs and asked, "Does the man who owns this house ever laugh?" 200 guests sat in the garden beneath strings of lights hanging from the maple trees, and the guest list was the most surreal picture that house had ever witnessed. Casino owners sitting beside a priest, the captain of the Port District standing in conversation with the children's pediatrician, Reed Galloway drinking champagne with Agnes Murphy, and Conrad Valerio, for the first time in his life, wearing a suit without carrying his silver cane because Margot had confiscated it that morning and refused to give it back. The 3 children carried flowers ahead of Phoebe down the aisle. Colette walked slowly and solemnly, making sure not a single petal fell. Margot walked while turning back to grin at her mother. Flynn made it halfway down the aisle, then tripped over a chair leg and fell flat on his face in the middle of the path, his bouquet flying out of his hand, and all 200 guests laughed together, the warm kind of laughter this house had waited a very long time to hear. Emilio stood beneath the floral arch, watching Phoebe walk toward him in the simple white dress she had chosen in exactly 15 minutes at the store, because she said, "A wedding dress doesn't need to be prettier than the woman wearing it." And he felt that everything he had ever lost no longer mattered. His vows were short, because Emilio wasn't a man of many words. "You made me cry with a bowl of instant noodles. In 37 years, no one asked me, 'Are you okay?' I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that question." Phoebe's vows were even shorter. I didn't know you were a mafia boss. I didn't know you were rich. I only knew you were a lonely man in a house too big for one person. And that's the man I loved." They kissed, and Flynn shouted from the front row, "Daddy's kissing Mommy! Daddy's kissing Mommy!" 200 people laughed again, and Emilio laughed with them, because now he knew how. The reception was halfway through when a security guard came to tell Emilio that someone uninvited was standing at the gate. Victoria Ashford. She had come alone, wearing a simple black dress, no jewelry, holding a manila envelope in her hand. She didn't come farther in, only stood at the edge of the garden and waited. Emilio looked at Phoebe. Phoebe looked back at him, then gave the slightest nod. Victoria walked forward and handed the envelope to Phoebe. Inside were the documents establishing a $2 million trust fund for the 3 children, Victoria's personal money, with no connection to the Ashford family. "This isn't atonement," Victoria said, and for the first time her voice wasn't sharp and cold, only tired. "Nothing could ever atone for what I did." Phoebe took the envelope, looked at Victoria with the same eyes this woman had once tried to destroy, and said, "I don't forgive you because you deserve it. I forgive you because my children deserve a mother who doesn't carry hatred." Victoria stood there for 3 more seconds, nodded once, then turned away. She didn't stay for the reception. She didn't ask to be accepted. She only came, spoke the truth, and left. When Victoria disappeared beyond the iron gate, Emilio stood beside Phoebe and asked, "How do you do that? Forgive the person who tried to destroy us?" Phoebe looked at her 3 children running beneath the lights in the garden. Flynn chasing Margot, Colette following behind, picking up fallen flower petals from the grass, and she answered, "Because holding on to hatred is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. I'm done being poisoned." 8 months after the wedding, on a Tuesday afternoon in May, Phoebe was sitting on the sofa reading to Colette when the first pain came. Not the kind of pain from an ordinary headache, the kind that felt like someone was tightening a steel band around her skull, exactly like the time she had been pregnant with the triplets. And the moment she recognized it, the blood in her body turned cold. She called Emilio in the calmest voice she could hold on to. "You need to come home. The baby. Something's wrong." The doctor at Northwestern Memorial confirmed it within an hour. Severe preeclampsia, dangerously high blood pressure, higher risk than usual because of her history with the triplet pregnancy and the complications before. Phoebe was only 7 months along. The baby wasn't ready to be born, but Phoebe's body wasn't allowing any more time. "We need emergency surgery right now," the doctor told Emilio in the hallway. "The baby is in fetal distress, and your wife's blood pressure is spiraling out of control. I need you to sign the consent forms and prepare for every possibility." Every possibility. 2 words doctors used when they didn't want to say outright that someone might not make it. Emilio signed the papers with a shaking hand, and when the operating room doors closed behind Phoebe, he stood in the hallway with both fists clenched at his sides and realized that this was the first time in his life he was completely helpless. He couldn't order anyone to save her, couldn't call anyone to fix this, couldn't use money, power, or threat to change a single thing happening behind that door. Conrad arrived with the 3 children 30 minutes later. Yelena had called him the moment she heard. Flynn, 3.5 years old, ran to hug Emilio's leg, then looked around the hospital hallway with worried gray eyes. "Where's Mommy, Daddy?" "Mommy's with the doctor, son. The doctor is helping the baby come out." Flynn nodded, sat down on the plastic chair beside Conrad, stayed quiet for 5 minutes, then slid off the chair and ran down the hallway. When he came back, he tugged on Conrad's sleeve and said in a small but clear voice, "Grandpa, Daddy's crying in the bathroom. I saw him." Conrad looked at his grandson, then looked toward the end of the hallway where the bathroom door had just closed. He stood, walked over, and pushed the door open. Emilio was sitting on the white tile floor, his back against the wall, his head bent between his knees, his shoulders shaking. The most powerful mafia boss in Chicago was sitting on the floor of a hospital bathroom and crying like the child Conrad had raised never to cry. "Stand up," Conrad said. "My son doesn't sit on the floor. I can't lose her, Dad. You won't lose her. Because if God takes her, he'll have the whole Valerio family to answer to. And I'm pretty sure he doesn't want that kind of trouble." Emilio lifted his head and looked at his father, and Conrad looked back with eyes that hadn't softened in 70 years. But now they had. Just a little. Just enough for Emilio to know he wasn't joking, And he wasn't speaking for comfort either. He was speaking because he believed it. Conrad held out his hand. Emilio took it. His father pulled him to his feet. 45 minutes later, the baby's cry rang down the hallway, loud, furious, protesting being dragged out of warmth before her time. The doctor came out with a tired smile. A girl, premature, but her numbers are good. She's in intensive care. My wife? She lost a lot of blood. We had to give 3 units. But she's stable. She's very strong. When Emilio was allowed into the room, Phoebe was lying in bed, pale, dark circles under her eyes, surrounded by IV lines and monitors, but her eyes were open. When she saw him, she gave him a weak smile. "Hi, husband." Emilio walked to her, kissed her forehead, kissed her hand, and couldn't say a word for the first 30 seconds, because his throat had locked shut. Together they went to the neonatal intensive care unit, where inside a tiny incubator lay a tiny baby, dark-haired like her mother. And when she opened her eyes for the first time, only for a moment, only for a few seconds, gray eyes looked up, like his, like Flynn's, like Colette's, like Margot's too. 4 now, Emilio whispered. 4 reasons to become a better man. Hope, Phoebe said. Her name is Hope, Hope Valerio, because she's proof that even when everything seems lost, life still finds a way to bloom. Outside the hospital, in the dark parking lot, a black sedan sat motionless from afternoon until late night. Victoria Ashford sat inside alone, calling no one, texting no one, only watching the lit windows of the maternity floor and waiting. When one of Conrad's security men, a man she knew would recognize her car, called to say that mother and baby were both safe, Victoria breathed out, started the engine, and drove into the night without stepping inside the hospital once. 6 months later, Victoria Ashford was diagnosed with terminal liver cancer. Felicity called Emilio with the news, her voice tired. Emilio told Phoebe. She was silent for a moment, then said, "We're going to see her." They went directly to the VIP room on the 12th floor of Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Victoria was lying in bed, smaller than Phoebe remembered, thinner, her skin yellowed, her silver hair sparse. When she saw them walk in, her eyes filled with tears. "I didn't think the 2 of you would come." Phoebe sat down beside the bed, took Victoria's thin hand in hers, and Victoria said in a voice where every word cost her effort, "You built on stone. I built on sand. The waves came, and the sand was swept away." "You can go in peace," Phoebe said. Victoria closed her eyes, and the small smile on her lips was the closest that face had ever come to peace. Victoria Ashford died 3 days later. After the funeral, Felicity came to Emilio and Phoebe. She stood before them without the cold mask she had worn in court, only a woman who had just lost her mother and was trying to find a way to keep living. "I know I'll never make up for any of it, but could we be friends? In time?" Phoebe looked at Felicity and saw in her the same thing she had once seen in Victoria in those final minutes, the weariness of someone who had worn a mask too long, and said, "She wasn't our enemy. She was the part of the past that led him to me." 5 years later, on a Sunday morning in October, autumn sunlight poured through the great glass windows of the Lake Forest mansion, and the house that had once been an empty fortress was now filled with the one thing money could never buy: laughter. 8-year-old Flynn sat at the chessboard across from Colette, the 2 of them arguing over the last move with the seriousness of generals at war, Flynn insisting that his knight could jump across 2 spaces in a row, and Colette calmly opening the rulebook to show him that no, it couldn't, and the argument had already lasted 20 minutes with no sign of ending. 8-year-old Margot sat in the corner of the living room, her paint spread across the floor, finishing the picture she had worked on all week. 6 people standing in front of a large house, 2 adults and 4 children, and 1 dog the family didn't actually have, but that Margot had added because, as she said, every family should have a dog. 4-year-old Hope sat in Conrad's lap. He was 75 now, his hair completely white, his back no longer straight as steel, but his arms were still steady enough to hold his granddaughter. He read to Hope in the roughened voice old age had given him, and Hope listened with the strange patience of a child who understood that Grandpa read slowly not because he couldn't read faster, but because he wanted to keep her in his lap for a few more minutes. Emilio stood at the kitchen doorway, black coffee in his hand, no sugar, watching Phoebe make pancakes. She sang softly the song her mother used to sing in Ridgeway, the one about the dirt road leading home after the rain, and her voice filled the kitchen with more warmth than any music the sound system in this house, worth tens of thousands of dollars. could ever play. The Valerio Empire was different now. It had taken Emilio 3 years to turn everything fully legitimate. The casinos had federal licenses. The real estate was clean to the last dollar. Their own restaurant chain stretched across the Midwest. The shipping ports ran transparently under government contracts. There were no more midnight calls, no more safes hiding guns, no more men in black suits coming and going without anyone asking their names. My children won't grow up having to explain why their father went to prison, Emilio had told Conrad when the old man asked why he was giving up half the underground empire. Conrad hadn't argued. He was 75. He had seen enough. And that Sunday morning, after the children finished breakfast and ran out into the garden, Conrad remained at the table with Emilio, silent for a long time, then said something he had never said in 75 years of living. I raised you to be a warrior. She taught you how to be a man. I was wrong, son. Emilio looked at his father, the man he had feared, admired, resented, and loved all at once for his entire life, and he nodded. Nothing more needed to be said. They both understood. That afternoon, the whole family drove back to Ridgeway. 4 hours on Interstate 57. 4 children watching movies on iPads in the back seat. Phoebe in the passenger seat watching the cornfields race past the window, and Emilio driving with one hand because the other was holding hers. The little cemetery behind the Baptist church hadn't changed at all in 5 years, except that there were no weeds around Phoebe's mother's grave anymore, because every month Emilio sent money to the caretaker to tend it, something he had never told Phoebe, but she knew. Flynn placed a bouquet of wildflowers he had picked along the roadside against the gravestone, carefully, solemnly, as if he were doing something sacred. Colette stood in front of the stone, placed her hand on the cold surface, and whispered, "Grandma, can you see our home?" Margot set the painting of the family of 6 and the dog beside the grave and said, "I drew this for Grandma. Grandma is the star in the sky in the picture." Hope held her mother's hand, not understanding all of what was happening, but understanding that this was an important place because Mommy was crying and smiling at the same time. Phoebe knelt before her mother's grave, placed her hand on the earth, and said, "I found my way home, Mom." On the drive back, when all 4 children had fallen asleep in the back seat, Emilio asked, "If you could change anything, what would you change?" Phoebe sat in silence for a while, watching the road, then answered, "Nothing at all. Not even the nights in the car. Not even the 4 miles walking through the snow, because all of it led me here. Here wasn't the mansion. It wasn't the empire. It wasn't the power. Here was his hand in hers. 4 children asleep in the back seat, and Phoebe's quiet singing filling the car, the song her mother once sang, now sung for her own children. Emilio Valerio, the man who had once controlled half of Chicago, finally understood that the most precious thing in life wasn't kept inside any safe. It was right here, and he would never lose it again. Emilio and Phoebe's story wasn't only a love story. It was a reminder that life isn't measured by what we own, but by who we're willing to sacrifice for. That forgiveness isn't a gift for the person who caused the hurt, but freedom for ourselves. And that no matter where you are, no matter how dark the night may be, whether you're sleeping in a car in the middle of winter or sitting alone in a house too large for one person, morning still comes, and with it comes the chance to begin again. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think of the people you love, please hit like and share this video with anyone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the emotional stories we bring every day. How did this story make you feel? If you were Phoebe, would you be strong enough to forgive Victoria? If you were Emilio, would you give up all that power to protect your family? Leave a comment and share what you truly feel deep in your heart. We read every line, and every story you share inspires us to keep bringing more meaningful stories to you. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.